Hey everybody, I don't know if that title caught your attention, How Boston Ruined Classic Rock, and then parenthetically, and also Star Wars. And I'm certainly not trying to disparage Star Wars, and in particular Boston, because obviously anybody who ever likes rock and roll, it's almost impossible to not just acknowledge, just as almost as a scientific objective thing, how great that first Boston album was. I remember hearing it at my friend's house in the fall of 1976, and no one had ever heard it. This guy had a really good stereo, and his brother had a lot of good albums, and he had picked this album up, and it was like when the school year had first started, kind of football season, and no one had ever heard of Boston, and he played this for me, and I thought it was kind of like this kind of underground album. That was the way I interpreted it. It was just like so good now, but it sounded really kind of underground. But by the spring, it had become massive, and I saw a documentary once, and this guy was talking actually about Hollywood, but he mentioned Boston in that same context. And he mentioned Star Wars and how Star Wars was such a revolutionary movie. And that also came out in 1976. And I remember seeing Star Wars at the theater with some friends on a Friday night back when it came out. I don't think the original Star Wars, I don't think it had been out for a week or two, and we went in the theater, and I just remember being blown away by the lightsabers and the Death Star and some of the special effects, and but also how well the movie was done and everything. But in this documentary I saw, this guy said Star Wars was kind of the beginning of the end of a very special period in Hollywood, because Star Wars was the first big blockbuster. And if you think about Hollywood ever since, it's been the quest for a blockbuster, how big The Weekend is, and so the films really kind of changed after Star Wars. But this guy mentioned Boston. He was really talking about movies, but he mentioned the album Boston by the band Boston as a kind of comparative point. How Boston was kind of like that for music. It was such a good album. But it was kind of the beginning of the end of the period of classic rock, because it was so huge. And after that, it wasn't Boston's fault that they did this great album. But after that, music kind of became more corporate and formulaic. And I remember that in the 70s. I remember a term some of you might remember, formula rock. And Boston was not formula rock, but this guy said that they were kind of ushered in the era of formula rock, and the albums all kind of got glitzier and more corporate looking, and they had they kind of diminished the emphasis on these kind of crazy rock stars that they used to have on the covers, and all kinds of iffy, dubious, or comedic poses, and they started having these kind of glitzy album covers that were a little more impersonal and mass, sort of reflected mass production. But this movie was really interesting, and ever since then, I've always kind of tied in this idea of 1976. That was the year Star Wars came out and Boston came out, and I'm old enough to remember that was right in the heyday of my teenage years. So, but this guy was talking about Hollywood. But that point about Boston made me realize that almost the same thing could be said about music. So this guy was talking about a little period in films, which would be mostly the early 70s and some in the late 60s, where when he was talking about films, the studio system that had run Hollywood all through the 40s and 50s and most of the 60s kind of collapsed. He mentioned Hello, Dolly with Barbra Streisand and Walter Matthau as being kind of one of the last old studio system movies, with the, all the studio casts, and it was kind of done in the old studio system. Not all that sure how the studio system worked, but I think they were kind of like, studios would contract all these actors, and it was kind of a movie making machine, and that kind of collapsed after Hello, Dolly, and you had movies like Midnight Cowboy come out, which was originally rated X, I think. And then you had this period where the studio system had kind of collapsed, and filmmakers did all these great movies. If you ever like movies in the early 70s, there were some really quiet, excellent little movies. Some of them can seem kind of dated, but there were all kinds of really well done movies in the 70s. And I also like even a lot of the bad movies are kind of indicative of that too. All the drive-in movies got. My friends and I, we live right by a drive-in, so I have the you know, I wouldn't say what a great cultural background it is, but I did see a lot of drive-in movies in my youth because we had a pretty active drive-in theater, and it was, all the kids in our town would go there quite often. And even the drive-in movies of the early 70s were kind of like that, just kind of, anything goes, whatever, let's try this, let's try that. And you didn't have these kind of movie companies, micromanaging every decision you made. And that also, I think, is kind of true in music because the AM music, the top 40 music, which is great, just like the old studio system. That was the old studio system made some of the greatest movies ever, and some of the old, record company contract systems. Was like the Brill Building, the Wrecking Crew, Muscle Shoals, a lot of those great bands and all the great music they did, they kind of came out of that system. Particularly, I think the Brill Building and Wrecking Crew. But a lot of that kind of collapsed in the late 60s as you started to have people writing their own songs, singer-songwriters, I guess would be kind of typical, but more bands started writing their own songs, kind of following the lead of the Beatles and the Stones, but that became much more the norm. And so, like in Hollywood, you had this little period from around 1968 to 1976 or so, where bands had all kinds of freedom, and the sense of corporate music had so diminished. There was still great AM music in the early 70s. That's the period when you had the Carpenters and just all kinds of great soul music. But in terms of rock music, that's when rock music really kind of went off the deep end, right around that time, if you think about it, 1968. And the bands back then did kind of whatever they wanted. They'd, make songs 20 minutes long or do weird songs like Cream Pressed Rat and Warthog or Hendrix If a Six turned out. They did, some of it was better than others, but they did whatever they wanted. And you had all these really cool albums. And some were kind of like a lot of the movies. Some were kind of hit and miss. Some were not, probably not that good in the first place, just like some of the movies. But you also had that kind of freedom and creativity produce some of the greatest movies ever. Like The Godfather came out in that period. And I've heard Francis Ford Coppola say that he doesn't know if they let him make that movie, if they would have let him make that movie the same way, either after, in the 80s or before he made it. So he made that great movie, The Godfather, right in that little window of time. Both Godfather 1 and 2 are in that period. But in music, that was great because you had album-oriented rock, and then the rise of FM, and which was sort of a radio format just for, mostly for album-oriented rock. And I actually kind of remember that. I was about 13 when I started shifting over from AM rock, kind of bubblegum, which I still like. I do a lot of AM top 40 nostalgia memorabilia stuff on here, but they kind of shifted over to album-oriented rock and FM. And I remember listening to FM, particularly like WWW in Detroit, WRIF in Detroit, and WABX in Detroit. And when I first started listening to them, they were still pretty underground. Like there was, every once in a while there'd be some anti-Vietnam War stuff on there, poetry readings at the library, and the guys, just play a whole album side, at 2 p.m. And that's another thing that kind of changed as the 70s went on. The corporations also got a hold of radio. But I always thought that was a pretty interesting analogy, or that Star Wars, as great as that movie was kind of the first blockbuster, and it was kind of, in some ways, the beginning of the end of a very special period in film. And that's not to disparage Star Wars, like I said, and there have been obviously a lot of great films that were made since Star Wars under the whatever system that exists now, but there was kind of a special time. And I also think that was sort of true in music. And as I think about it, I think it was true in radio too. In the early 70s, FM rock was great, and it was great, all the way through the mid 70s. And by the late 70s, they didn't call it classic rock yet, but they were narrowing their playlists, and it was getting more corporate and kind of mass media than it had been. I remember WRF in Detroit was very kind of almost like a local station. I think when I was like 12 or 13, but I remember it was almost like a Detroit local station. For the first little while I listened to it. And so that was kind of a weird time. I don't know if it was something that was going on economically, And it's interesting that probably two of the greatest things ever done in American creativity, which would probably be Star Wars. I'm not a huge Star Wars fan, by the way. Yeah, I like it. I think that it's kind of one of those things that it's been done to death. But I remember really enjoying the movie, obviously, when I was like 15 or whatever I was when I saw it, the very first one. But that also kind of happened in music, I think, with Boston. Boston was such a good album. But after that, everybody said, "Man, we got to do that again." Tom Scholz in Boston, he did it right. He got it. It wasn't a formula, but it was perfect. Like that Boston album is perfect. You know, there aren't very many perfect albums, but I've heard other people use that term "perfect album." Actually, one album I heard about that was a perfect album was it Michael Jackson Thriller or the one before it, Off the Wall. Somebody said that's a perfect album. And there are a couple other albums people describe as perfect. Every little thing is perfect. And that Boston album's kind of a perfect album, and it's just got such great songwriting and arranging. And Tom Scholz had been so meticulous and creative in putting that together. And I think a lot of people in the music business said, we're going to do that. What he did, we're going to do that every time. We're going to just like have these perfect albums. And that was sort of the beginning of Formula Rock. Just like with Star Wars, it was sort of the beginning of the blockbuster. And in FM radio, you kind of started moving away from album-oriented rock and kind of the underground FM to a more corporate mass media radio market. So I just kind of wanted to say that. By the way, I'm testing out this new Audigo mic. And that's one reason I haven't been making too many videos. I'm trying to get a little better sound. So we'll see how this thing sounds. And I'm going to upload it. And if it sounds bad, I'll delete it or privatize it. But thanks. God bless.